Hello, everybody. My name is Ramachandra Guha. I'm a historian and failed cricketer. Or I should say, a historian because I was a failed cricketer. And I'm going to argue that India is the most interesting country in the world. Not because we play cricket, because other countries do. Not because we watch films, which are the 20th century's greatest popular passion. But because we are the world's least likely nation, as well as its least likely democracy. And I should start by explaining what I mean. If you look at the history of nationalism in the modern world, nations were brought into being when the citizens of a particular unified territory were made to subscribe to the same religion, speak the same language, and have a common enemy. Look at the history of England, as chronicled in the great work Forging the Nation by Linda Colley. The British essentially defined themselves as Protestant and against Catholic. They were united around a common language. So a standard English extinguished the dialects of Welsh and Gaelic and Scottish and so on, and the English were united by a common enemy, the French. You go across the channel and it's exactly the reverse. Because the British are Protestant, the French are Catholic. They're united by hatred of England, and again, standard French came into being by often ruthlessly suppressing the variants and dialects spoken around. Across Europe, Poland. What unites Poland? Why is there a Polish people? It's because they are Catholic, which is why Jews were historically discriminated against in the process of nation forming. They speak the same language, Poland, and they detest either Germany or Russia, depending on who is their major military rival at that point of time. By the standard definition of nationalism, Pakistan is a perfect European nation. Pakistan came into being because some Muslims felt insecure in the larger space of British India. So they were united by religion, by language. So Urdu was imposed even on Punjabi and Bengali speakers. And of course, Pakistanis hate India. Now, what is extraordinary about the Republic of India as a national experiment, and what makes it unique in the history of the modern world, is that Indians don't even hate Pakistan. And of course, they don't speak a common language. If you look at the rupee note, you'll see 17 scripts represented on it, not just 17 languages. And as explained in the article that Piyush read out, we are a dominantly Hindu country with a Sikh prime minister, whose most powerful person today was born in Italy and raised in a Catholic household. We have the oldest synagogues in the world. Australia considers itself a Christian nation. We have more Christians than Australia. We have more Buddhists than Tibet, and so on and so forth. So it's the most, in a sense, unnatural nation in the world. It's also the world's least likely democracy. Every time India holds a general election, it's the largest exercise of the democratic franchise in the world's history. 2 months from now, 700 million Indians will vote. And although questions are raised about the capability and functioning of many Indian institutions, including the BCCI, no one has ever questioned the impartiality and efficiency of the Election Commission of India. And after Florida in, 2000, we haven't had a Florida in the last 40 or 50 or 60 years. But again, democracy is counterintuitive, because poor countries are not supposed to be democratic. If you look at the history of the franchise in the West, the vote was granted in stages. First, only men of property were allowed to vote. Then men of education were added to the roster. After a long struggle, working class men were permitted to choose the politicians who ruled over them, and after an even longer struggle, the vote was extended to women. In some parts of Switzerland, women could not vote as late as 1971. By contrast, India became independent in 1947. It enacted its first democratic constitution in 1950. 18 months later, we had our first general elections. Those elections were widely mocked as the biggest gamble in history. Well, it's a gamble that has paid off, apart from the national elections. There are regular, free and fair elections in all our states, some of which are larger than France or Germany. And these elections were conducted despite the fact that more than 65% of the electorate was illiterate. So that's what makes India the most interesting country in the world. It is the most recklessly ambitious and ambitiously reckless political experiment ever conducted by humans. And it still survives. And the burden of my talk today is to try and explain to you why we have this extraordinarily diverse country holding together as a single nation and run, unlike other ex-colonial countries, on democratic principles. Some years ago, I was in a panel at the University of California in Berkeley with a friend from Indonesia. And as Indians often do, I was mocking the government of my country. And he said, Ram, why are you so critical? In your country, at least you have general elections. In my country, we have the elections of the generals. And the extraordinary thing about India is that the army has kept completely out of politics. So how did this happen? Could it have happened? I'm going to give you a few prophecies of those foreign writers who were convinced that a united and democratic India would never survive. My first prophecy dates from the year 1915, when Mahatma Gandhi, the great leader of the Indian freedom struggle, comes back to this country. And the national movement is just gathering steam. At this time, the Bishop of Calcutta, a man called J.E.C. Weldon, wrote. This is the time when Indian nationalists were calling for political freedom. The Bishop of Calcutta wrote, and I quote, "The disappearance of the British Raj is at present and must for a long time be simply inconceivable. That it should be replaced by a native government or governments is the wildest of wild dreams." And then he continues, "As soon as the last British soldier sailed from Bombay and Karachi, India would become the battleground of antagonistic racial and religious conflicts, and the peaceful and progressive civilization that Great Britain had allegedly brought to India would shrivel up in a night." The peaceful and progressive civilization that Britain brought to India, that's 1915, would shrivel up in a night. That's 100 years ago. Move to 1930, the year of Mahatma Gandhi's Great Salt March, which catalyzed and mobilized the Indian people across this far-flung land in a great mass struggle against British imperialism. Following Gandhi's march, Winston Churchill, then an out-of-work politician in Great Britain, went up and down his country, making a series of speeches mocking the nationalist pretensions of the Indians. In one of these speeches, he said, in words that resonate with those of the Bishop of Calcutta, "If the British leave India, an army of white janissaries, officered if necessary from Germany, will be hired to secure the armed ascendancy of the Hindu." We're still waiting for that army of German missionaries to maintain our rule. And then Churchill continues, "To abandon India to the rule of the Brahmins," who in his opinion dominated the Congress party, "to abandon India to the rule of the Brahmins would be an act of cruel and wicked negligence. For then India will fall back quite rapidly through the centuries into the barbarism and privations of the Middle Ages." Now, there's a whole series of such predictions, and they don't stop with Indian independence. Through the 50s, through the 60s, through the 70s, whenever there was a skirmish between Hindus and Muslims, whenever the monsoons failed, there were predictions that India would collapse. It would become a military dictatorship, it would balkanize into many parts, it would become a theater of rival religious and linguistic and racial conflicts. Now, why did this not happen? Why does India survive as a united and democratic country? It's a standing rebuke to the prophets of doom, but it's also a striking anomaly in the developing world, on the ex-colonial world. Why hasn't India gone the way of sub-Saharan Africa, or of Yugoslavia, or of Pakistan, or of Sudan, or of the totalitarian dictatorships in China and Vietnam and so on and so forth? Why? And that's really the puzzle that I'd like to answer or unravel in the next part of my talk. Why does a united and democratic India survive? And I've outlined 6 reasons in ascending order of, well, I'll come to the most important reason last, but I'll give you the first 5. 2 you've already had some exposure to. The Indian film, which I don't know whether Shekhar will agree with me, but I detest the word Bollywood because it's derivative, and Indian films are made, again with due respect to Shekhar, in places other than Bombay. I come from Bangalore, which is a thriving film industry, also Tamil Nadu, also Andhra. So the Indian film, which is a vehicle of popular aspirations, it's a showcasing for culture, art, music, poetry. Some of the greatest modern poetry is in Indian films, and that's part of our dialogue. And now, partly because of the efforts of agencies like Ogilvy and Mehta, also in currency in our everyday discourse. So the Indian film is one reason why we are united, because it's a theater, a showcasing of the most interesting, innovative, humorous, melancholy aspects of our culture. The second is the game of cricket, which again brings together this country. One important aspect of both cricket and film is that they are the 2 theaters in which religious minorities have never faced any kind of discrimination. Whether they be Muslims or Sikhs or Parsis, you'll see that they're abundantly and widely represented in these 2 spheres. So there's the film, there's cricket. A third uniting feature are some of the institutional legacies of the British, including the railways and the English language. One of the reasons we communicate here is because we can communicate in English. And there was a movement in the 1950s and 60s, led by Hindi zealots from North India, to extinguish English. The idea was it's a foreign language. There was also a paranoia born out of the understanding of European nationalism that every Indian must speak the same language. So Hindi must become the national language. Hindi is spoken by about 35% of the population, but is comprehensively misunderstood in large parts of South India. And as part of this movement of zealotry, the chief minister of the northern Indian state of Uttar Pradesh wrote a letter in Hindi to the chief minister of the southern state of Tamil Nadu. And the answer came back in Tamil, which is a language even more comprehensively misunderstood in North India. And along with that answer in Tamil, the next week, the chief minister of Tamil Nadu wrote another letter to his aggressively militant, chauvinistic counterpart, Hindi-speaking counterpart in North India, saying, you say English is a foreign language, but our scriptures teach us that the goddess Saraswati gave birth to all the languages, which means she gave birth to English too. So English is as much as Indian language. A fourth uniting feature is the shared moral universe and imagination that we get from the epics. The great Ramayana and the Mahabharata have provided us with an inexhaustible stock of stories, symbols, similes, metaphors to explain, understand, appreciate everyday social and personal relations. A fifth uniting feature is the territorial boundaries, the Himalaya on the north and the oceans on the 3 sides. And the sixth uniting feature, the sixth and the most fundamental reason why India is the most interesting country in the world, that it is the world's most reckless political experiment which has survived, is the vision and practice of the Indian founding fathers, as embodied in the Indian Constitution. I've written extensively on this elsewhere. I've written many biographical studies of the people who founded India. People like Gandhi and Nehru and Ambedkar and Rabindranath Tagore. People who are at once actors and thinkers, who mobilized mass popular movements but wrote profoundly insightful historical, sociological, literary works. And in the history of the modern world, Possibly only the United States has had a comparable concatenation of exceptional men, in our case, exceptional men and women, who were present at the founding of the nation. And in a comparative essay I once wrote, comparing India to the United States, I argued that a great complex nation, India and the United States are the two world's greatest nations in terms of their diversity, not in terms of their power or their wealth, the most interesting countries in the world. And nations that are diverse, complex, require visionaries to found them, although they can be led in mid-career by mediocrities. You know, the distance, I wrote this in, I think it was 2004, where I said the distance between Thomas Jefferson and George W. Bush, large as it may seem, is no larger than the distance between Mahatma Gandhi and Sonia Gandhi. So our founders were absolutely exceptional. And they gave us an Indian constitution whose building blocks really sustain us. And these building blocks are five in all. One, democracy based on universal adult franchise, which was counterintuitive, unhistorical, regarded as reckless, stupid, religious pluralism. Again, this was an act of great bravery and courage, and also counterintuitive, precisely because when India was born, it was also divided, and Pakistan was constituted as a Muslim homeland. And our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who is in many ways the most underappreciated figure in India today. You know, the posthumous career of Jawaharlal Nehru is an inversion of the biblical injunction. In the Bible, it is said that the sins of your fathers will be visited upon you. And in Nehru's case, the sins of 7 successive generations have been visited retrospectively upon him. He truly was one of them, with next only to Gandhi, the maker of modern India. And one of his fundamental contributions, decisive and definitive contributions, without which, friends, we would not be meeting today, was his determined insistence that whatever Pakistan did to its minorities, Pakistan drove out its Hindus and Sikhs, but we would give every citizen of India equal rights. India is not a Hindu Pakistan, largely because of the courage and vision of Jawaharlal Nehru. So that's idea number 2. Idea number 3 is federalism. That our constitution very carefully demarcated, it wasn't excessively centralizing. It also gave large powers to the states. So education, health, law and order. One of the remarkable features of the Indian success story now, of course, is the rivalry between states. And we have, in this large and complex country, across it, a legitimate state system permitting free and safe movement of goods and people across India. And this, again, was very, very difficult to achieve. Nehru had a great colleague who's somewhat better known and appreciated today, and for the right reasons, Vallabhbhai Patel, who was his deputy prime minister, and one of whose primary responsibilities was bringing the 500 princely states who were semi-autonomous on board. You know, the British rulers, I have to say, in an act of shameful negligence, handed over power to an Indian government, but left the 500 princely states whose territories were scattered around in a kind of totally anomalous status. And the most important was Hyderabad, which extended across the heart of India. Vallabhbhai Patel famously called it a cancer in the heart of India. And the Nizam of Hyderabad was the world's richest man and also one of the most miserly, and that combination is still not uncommon, I should say. And he was determined to be independent. And it took a great deal of effort and persuasion to get the Nizam on board. Through coercion, bribery, flattery, the other princely states came on board, and a united national territory was created. This, again, is a colossal achievement. And present generations of Indians don't really know about it. I was recently speaking to the Bangalore software giant Infosys, to a large group of engineer trainees. and there were 500 of them, and I asked them, this is in Bangalore, I said, how many of you are from north of the Vindhyas? And about 40% raised their hands. And I said, had Sardar Patel not united India, had the Nizam of Hyderabad still been independent, you couldn't have come here and taken a job. So in a sense, the unity of India, the territorial unity of India, the building of a democratic template, the nurturing and promotion of linguistic and religious freedoms, the holding of free, fair, and regular institutions, the keeping and the furthering of British institutions such as the railways and the civil service, which kept this complex country together. These contributions of the first generation of founding figures are, in my view, even more important to the India story than the economic reforms of P.V. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh. Because none of this could have happened had we fragmented, had we not been united, had we not permitted religious and linguistic pluralism. In 1956, India decided every state of the Union would have its administration conducted in the language of its choice. That's why we do not have a single national language. We have 16 or 18 languages. In the same year, 1956, the Sinhala Prime Minister of Sri Lanka imposed his language on the Tamils of the north and thus started a civil war which still continues. The first speech Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the first Governor General of Pakistan, made in Dhaka was to tell the Bengali speakers, you have to learn Urdu, thus sowing the seeds of the civil war that resulted in the creation of Bangladesh. So the vision, the courage, the capacity, the institution building of the founding fathers, their nurturing of a democratic ethos, their sustenance of linguistic and religious pluralism, their creation of impartial institutions such as the Election Commission, the Comptroller Accountant General, their respect for the freedom of the press and the independence of the judiciary are really the reason that this extraordinary, miraculous political experiment has survived. And the foundations they built were so solid that all the later politicians who have at times been narrow-minded, sectarian, authoritarian, have tried to damage the tree. They've occasionally cut off a branch or some leaves here and there. They've not been able to disturb those foundations. And the economic prosperity, the cultural efflorescence, the great Hindi film industry, the thriving game of cricket, the free and movement of peoples, the exchange of ideas, the entrepreneurial innovation, all this really has been fundamentally made possible because of the steady, patient, unglamorous, and often unrecognized work of our first generation of politicians, civil servants, bureaucrats, jurists, and so on. I want to end with another quote. I began with a few mocking remarks by British observers of India, predicting that we would fail, that we would collapse, that the Germans would have to come and rule us, or the British should really stay here forever, and so on. I'm going to end with a different kind of quotation, and appropriately, it's from a dissenting Scotsman. And I'll say a little bit about this man, because long before Sonia Gandhi, the Italian Catholic, came and lived in India, this man, who was the greatest biologist of his time, a Scotsman called J.B.S. Haldane, came and made his home in India. In 1956, J.B.S. Haldane, I don't know how many people here, I mean, maybe there are not many science students here, but after Darwin, there have been three great biologists in the history of modern biology, and Haldane is one of them. Fisher and Dobzhansky are the other two. So one of the world's greatest biologists who had successively held chairs in Oxford, Cambridge, and University College London, decided in 1956 to abandon a safe, secure, prosperous intellectual career in England to come to this country, which is completely strange and bizarre because normally ambitious young scientists move westwards. Here's a great scientist moving eastwards. And he was asked, why have you moved? And he was a whimsical, slightly eccentric man, which is why I like quoting him. And he said, he gave various reasons. Once he said, this was just after the Suez fiasco. He said, England is still an imperial country. I don't want to live in it. Completely true. To another questioner, he said, Jawaharlal Nehru is a more attractive prime minister than Anthony Eden, undoubtedly true. So that was reason number 2. And when a third questioner asked him, he said, 60 years in socks was enough. So next time, friends, please ask Piyush to have your meeting in Goa and not in Delhi, because unfortunately you're bringing your socks here. But this is what Haldane said, 60 years in socks was enough. So he moves to India in 1956, becomes an Indian citizen, takes up a professorship in the Indian Statistical Institute. And before I carry on to his quote, I should add that the real reason he moved to India was none of the above. It was that as a great and visionary biologist, he recognized that the future of biology lay in the tropics because of the greater ecological diversity of the tropics as compared to cold, homogeneous, inhospitable England. Inhospitable not just to him and his socks, but to all other forms of life. So anyway, he comes here, becomes an Indian citizen, becomes a professor at the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. And in 1960, the American Science magazine writes a profile of this great biologist. And the man who wrote the profile called Haldane in this appreciative essay, called Haldane a citizen of the world. Now, that's an appellation. Citizen of the world, many of us would like to proudly avow. I am a citizen of the world. But Haldane, being the kind of man he was, violently disagreed. So he wrote an answer to this journalist. He said, no doubt I am in some sense a citizen of the world. Then he continues, but I believe with Thomas Jefferson that one of the chief duties of a citizen is to be a nuisance to the government of his state. As there is no world state, I cannot do this. Then he continues, on the other hand, I can be and am a nuisance to the government of India, which has the merit of permitting a good deal of criticism, although it responds to it rather slowly. Now, that's still my experience, by the way. The government of India has the merit of permitting a good deal of criticism, although it responds to it rather slowly. Then Haldane continues, and this is the definitive paragraph. He says, I also happen to be proud of being a citizen of India, which is a lot more diverse than Europe, let alone the USA, USSR, or China, and thus a better model for a possible world organization. It may, of course, break up, but it is a wonderful experiment. So I want to be labeled a citizen of India. This was in 1960. The next year, 1961, Haldane wrote an article in a British newspaper where he called India the closest approximation to the free world. Now, this is the Cold War, where the Americans think they're the leaders of the free world and everyone is not just unfree but benighted. And here is a Scotsman living in Calcutta saying India is the closest approximation to the free world. So an American friend of Haldane, who was a professor of biology at the University of California, protested. He wrote to Haldane saying, you say India is the closest approximation to the free world, but my impression is India has its fair share of scoundrels and a tremendous amount of poor, unthinking, and disgustingly subservient individuals who are not attractive. And to this, Haldane replied, perhaps one is freer to be a scoundrel in India than elsewhere. So it was in the USA, in the days of people like Jay Gould, that is the 1920s, the Gilded Age, when, in my opinion, there was more internal freedom in the USA than there is today. As for what you call the disgusting subservience of the others, this has its limits. The people of Calcutta riot, upset trams, and refuse to obey police regulations in a manner which would have delighted Jefferson. I don't think their activities are very efficient, but that is not the question at issue. Now, these words of this Scotsman, I think, tell you far better than mine why this is sometimes the most exasperating, but always the most interesting country in the world. I'll just end with one last prediction of mine. You know, I'm a historian. And in my published writings, I very cautiously stay clear of prediction, although I recognize that if I was to study the future rather than the past and become an astrologer, particularly in my country, it would be a profitable change of profession. But I'm not sure I can call the future. So I wrote a book in 2007 where I said, based on some of what I've shared with you today, I said, as a multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious political experiment, the Republic of India anticipated the European Union by a mere matter of 50 years. This is what I wrote in 2007. And in 2014, I would like to add an addendum to that remark, that it looks as if the Republic of India will outlast the European Union by at least 50 years. Thank you very much.